Welcome to Non-Human Entities YouTube channel. Please subscribe, like, and share if you enjoy this show.
Hello.
Well, hello. Good evening, Robert. How are you tonight? This is Michael Vera with Late Night in the Midlands.
Very good. Very good. Good to hear you.
Hey, it's great to have you on the show tonight. I am looking so forward to speaking with you, and I do thank you for taking time out to be with us.
Oh, you're very welcome.
All right. Well, Robert, I thought maybe a good place to start, outside of welcoming you, is maybe you could tell me a little bit about how you got started in this research, and give us a little background.
Okay. Well, that's a large topic, but I can boil it down to I've been working on ancient civilizations. I began with the Sphinx back in the actually late 1980s. First went to Egypt in 1990 at the invitation of John Anthony West. My PhD is in geology and geophysics from Yale. And I've been a faculty member at Boston University full-time since 1984. I met John Anthony West in the late 1980s. He re-perked my interest, should we say, in ancient civilization, something that I had always been interested in. And in particular, he solicited my help as a geologist to look at the Great Sphinx and what the true age of the Great Sphinx might be. So that's really how I began in this business. And for those that aren't familiar with the story, the bottom line is that the Sphinx was traditionally dated to 2500 BC. Through my geological analysis, back then I determined, and I stick by it, more than 25 years later, that the core body of the Great Sphinx goes back thousands of years earlier to what I refer to as an earlier cycle of civilization, which actually goes back to the end of the last ice age. The last ice age ended 9700 BC. And I talk all about this in Forgotten Civilization, one of my books.
That's incredible. Now, so if I understand it, there was you were able to do this how? Because of signs of water? Is that correct?
To make, again, a long story short, the body of the Sphinx, the core body of the Sphinx, and the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, for those who have not been to Egypt, they should realize that the Sphinx does not sit up on the plateau. It does not sit up on ground level. Only the head is above the original ground level. To carve the body of the Sphinx, the ancients cut down into the bedrock. So they quarried into the bedrock to free the body of the Sphinx. So it actually sits in what's known as the Sphinx ditch or the Sphinx enclosure. When you look at the walls of the Sphinx enclosure and the sides of the body of the Sphinx itself, where you can still see it because there's many ancient repairs to it, what one sees is water weathering. Weathering and erosion that's caused by precipitation, by water, by rainfall, and this is incompatible with the last 5,000 years of Sahara desert conditions which the Sphinx has endured. So it immediately said to me, as a geologist, that there's something amiss here, and suggested, and I've been able to confirm that since, that the oldest portions of the Sphinx, the core body of the Sphinx, go back to a pre-Sahara period, so pre-desert period, and not just slightly into that period, but given the level of erosion, given the level of the type and distribution of weathering, it must be thousands of years earlier. And I do want to point out that the head of the Sphinx is a recarving. It's a dynastic head. It's not the original head. My suspicion is that originally the Sphinx was simply a lion, and the head was heavily eroded over the millennia. It was recarved during dynastic times, probably 4,500 or so years ago. But what I'm referring to is actually the proto-Sphinx, or the core body of the Sphinx, and I now date it to about 10,000 BC at the end of the last ice age. And this was very radical when I first came out with this more than 25 years ago, and I was really lambasted by my academics and in the public arena. It was very, very actually vicious and violent. But since then, we have evidence from elsewhere in the world, for instance, in Turkey at Göbekli Tepe, that yes, there was civilization, there were sophisticated cultures that were doing, among other things, building megalithic stone structures 10,000 BC. So I've really been, I feel, vindicated in the last decade or so.
Incredible. Now, what do you suppose caused the changes? Were they drastic changes that happened to the environment? Because, like you say, it was, I guess, that was once a very plentiful area with plants and water and all that good stuff.
Yeah, yes. In fact, that's really the bigger part of the story, as far as I'm concerned. Or the more important part of the story is that we had this early cycle of civilization, as I refer to it, and it was absolutely devastated in 9700 BC at the end of the last ice age. And to cut to the chase, what caused that was a major solar outburst. The sun went crazy. It had what was known as, I call it a solar outburst as a general term. There were major solar flares, coronal mass ejections. It shot out what's known as plasma, electrically charged particles, traveling at, in some cases, close to the speed of light, or at least hypervelocities. And this hit Earth and caused incredible climatic changes literally overnight. And we see that in Greenland ice cores, for instance. We can now date, or we can pinpoint the end of the last ice age based on various isotopes and whatnot. And we can also see solar activity using isotope proxies. And we can pinpoint that this occurred not over decades, not over several years, not even over a year, but within weeks, probably overnight, literally overnight. So we were hit, I believe, based on the evidence, by a huge, massive solar outburst. This caused glaciers to melt at incredible rates, literally overnight. You can think of plasma or fire hitting the Earth in some cases. So you put all this moisture into the atmosphere. It was also melting, so not just melting glaciers, but evaporating water in certain areas. You get all this moisture into the atmosphere. It comes down again as torrential rains. This was causing some of the major erosion, I believe, on the Sphinx and in the Sphinx enclosure. So, and we have worldwide, of course, not just physical evidence geologically, but the legends and myths of, deluges, torrential rains, flooding, and all of this ties back to what was physically happening at the end of the last ice age. There was earthquake activity in excess as you were getting, as glaciers were melting at high latitudes, taking pressure off of the crust of the Earth, caused earthquake activity to accelerate, caused volcanic activity to accelerate. Because of the breakdown of the magnetosphere, it was very high radiation levels on the surface of the Earth because of plasma hitting. You would have cases where you literally had incineration on the surface of the Earth, vitrification, wildfires being set. It was really quite horrible, devastating times. Yeah. And a lot of people, to put it blunt, would have died. The way to escape it, and this is what pockets of humanity did in some areas was essentially to go underground, to go into natural caves, to build rock shelters, that type of thing. And also what survives is primarily huge megalithic structures that could survive the devastation that was occurring.
You know,
things in a nutshell.
Robert, it almost sounds like you're describing today, in a sense, you know, with the earthquakes, the weather's gone crazy.
Yeah, but what we're talking about at the end of the last ice age is, frankly, orders of magnitude greater than what we have today.
Ooh.
But there is a major issue here, and you've just hit upon it, which is that we're talking about a very volatile sun at the end of the last ice age that spewed out its, I hate to be anthropomorphic, but sort of venom. It went volatile, was very volatile, it was very erratic, and we were hit by this major solar outburst. The isotope data, which tracks solar activity, shows this incredible activity 12,000 years ago, approximately 9,700 BC. For the sun, it calmed down after that in the centuries and millennia. After that, the sun was relatively stable, non-erratic, let me put it that way, until just recently. And when I say just recently, the last 50 to 70 years, and particularly going into our own period, the sun has become more active again, more volatile, more erratic, if you want to think of it anthropomorphically, mood swings. And we're seeing that in part reflected in our weather and our strange weather patterns and other things that are happening. But I believe this is and I'm not a doomsayer, I'm just going by the evidence. I believe this is indicative of more to come, and that if I use a geological analogy, we're looking at little foreshocks before the major earthquake. We're looking at erratic aspects of the sun. We had something known as the Carrington event in 1859. If we had the Carrington event was a solar outburst, relatively minor astrophysically, but major from a human perspective if it were to happen today. Back then, we didn't have the electronics and electrical-based society that we have now. Back in 1859, essentially all they had was telegraph lines when it came to electrical utilities, and those were completely fried, telegraph stations burnt down, etc., from the Carrington event. If we had a Carrington event today, and it will come, I hate to say, it would just blow out the electrical grid system. It would, the first thing that would go actually would be the satellites, because they would be hit first. It would destroy communications. I mean, it would be devastating to our modern electronic-based society.
Well,
and it would be relatively minor compared to what happened at the end of the last ice age. So, you know, I'm a geologist. These things happen. And you can close your eyes and say, well, it's not going to happen, but that's not the case. I mean, they happen.
Well, you know, what's crazy, Robert, is that we know these things happen, and it's not a matter of if they happen, it's more
it's
when.
a matter of when.
Yeah, and we don't do enough to protect ourselves from it.
No, we in our society, our modern American society, tend to be very, very short-sighted. For people to think 5 years in advance, that's a big deal. and something that I think we have to learn from the ancient societies, ancient civilizations, is that, in fact, they thought in terms of cycles, long-term cycles. They were thinking in terms of not just centuries, but millennia. They were looking at things like precession, not just because they were worried about the stars shifting in the sky a little bit, but I think they knew that there were major cycles, and I hate to use the term cycles of catastrophe, but cycles of volatility, cycles that had real effects on Earth.
And in your research, because I know people are always curious about this, especially when we're talking about the sun being perturbed and such, was there any evidence found of maybe civilizations talking about something that was out in space, some other body that might have, I don't know, interrupted or perturbed the sun in some way, or is that just myth?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to, but let me answer it this way. There's a lot of, I believe, circumstantial evidence in the legends, etc., depending on how you interpret it, that we may well be in a binary system, that our sun may be part of a binary system. What that means is that our sun may in fact be not technically orbiting around another star, but that another star, our star-like object, and the sun are orbiting around the center of mass, and so they would come closer to each other at some points, further away, etc., and have influences on each other. And what we find astrophysically in modern times, in just the last few years, is that in fact possibly the majority of stars are in binary systems. They're even trinary systems, etc. So a lot of people scoff at this and say, well, you don't see another sun out there. No, you wouldn't necessarily see the binary companion of our star, our sun, because it may be dark, it may be some kind of dark massive object, or it may be a close-by star that we have not made the connection that it's actually in tandem. Some people have, in fact, suggested that Sirius, the star Sirius, may be our binary companion. I'm not advocating that position. If there's a binary companion, I think it may, in fact, be a dark companion, dark massive companion.
I would probably guess that there's most definitely a companion somewhere out there.
Yeah. There's a lot of evidence. I mean, I've been looking into this. There's a colleague of mine, Walter Cruttenden, who sponsors periodically, it's not necessarily every year, but what's known as the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. But he is a very strong advocate that our star, our sun, has a binary companion, is part of a binary system, and in fact that this is a better way to explain many astrophysical phenomena than the standard models. For instance, precession, if people know what precession is. Precession, not to get into a lot of technical things, but people maybe know of the concept of the age of Aries, the age of Pisces, the age of Aquarius. Well, that has to do with precession and where the sun is relative to the stars, usually measured on the vernal equinox, on the spring equinox. But there's these shifting things in the sky, which the classical explanation is, well, we spin on our axis. That's absolutely true. The axis is tilted relative to our orbit around the sun, but that the axis is shifting, sort of like a wobbling top, and this causes precession. Well, that may play into account, but it also may play into account if we're being shifted, if you would, or changed because of a binary companion.
Fascinating, yeah, because there's a lot of talk these days about Planet X and Nibiru and and so there's supposed to be these ancient stories of this kind of thing, but I think that's what it makes the most sense to me that there's this binary whatever star out there.
I mean, the more I've looked into it, the more evidence I see for it, that there is a binary companion to our star, to our sun. And I'm when I say evidence, both astrophysical evidence, hardcore quote scientific evidence, but also evidence based on the ancient legends and the ancient art and that type of thing, which seem to indicate knowledge and ancient knowledge of a binary companion, and that this binary companion is, affects things on Earth ultimately because it affects activity of our star, of our sun.
Well, yeah, I had somebody laugh at me once when I told them that our sun activity has a lot to do with our weather. They don't want to believe. Some people don't want to believe that, but it.
No, they don't. It absolutely does, and it's actually not to oversimplify things, because I hate oversimplifying things, but sometimes it's good to start with the oversimplification. A lot of people will argue, and I mean, when I say a lot of people, I'm talking academic scientists, that, the sun does not vary by any great degree in its output, etc. So it's not like it gets hotter and brighter to the extent that it could cause changes, significant changes, or any changes in terms of climate or Earth patterns. Well, no, that's not the mechanism. The mechanism is that the sun does vary in its output. The solar wind varies. You have various solar flares, etc., etc. And what it does is it affects the magnetosphere. It affects cosmic rays coming into the atmosphere of the Earth, and whether you have more or fewer cosmic rays, that affects what's known as nucleation in the atmosphere, which affects cloud cover, and the changing cloud cover, which is directly related to solar activity, affects climate. So, that's just one, I'm just mentioning one mechanism where what seems like a very small change from a certain perspective of the sun actually has an incredible effect on Earth. And when you track solar activity with climate and temperatures on Earth, they track 1-to-1. It's an incredible correlation. So, a lot of my academic colleagues don't want to hear these types of things, but as far as I'm concerned, changes in global temperature overall, the whole business of global climate change, global warming, etc. I don't want to deny that, we should clean up our act, and we shouldn't be using so much oil and that type of thing and polluting. But on the other hand, frankly, solar activity and climate have been tracking each other. The solar activity has been affecting climate long before humans were on Earth. We know this from very good sediment and ice core data. And it's frankly nonsense and hubris on the part of humans to think that we're the only factor affecting climate change, or that we're even a major factor.
I totally agree with that. I think that humans are not helping as far as, pollution and this and that. Yeah, I'll go that far. But to think that us driving an SUV is changing the climate, I just don't buy that at all.
I mean, there's just a lot of other factors involved. And you can look at, and this ties in with the last ice age and ice ages before that, carbon dioxide levels and temperature levels, which we can get by various proxies, and solar activity, they all track each other long before humans were in any position to have any effect on anything, even before humans were around. And it's interesting, too, that climate, when you look at global temperatures, it's actually the temperatures that go up first, and then carbon dioxide levels. Now, yes, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and once it starts going up, it has effect and continues to pattern. But in fact, what the data says is that the temperatures go up first due to solar activity. And from my point of view, geologically, for instance, it's very evident that, once you start warming up the atmosphere, once you start warming up the oceans, warmer oceans can't hold as much carbon dioxide, so it starts outgassing. You start warming up higher latitudes, and it gives off carbon dioxide as you melt permafrost. It gives off carbon, it gives off methane too, etc. So it gives off greenhouse gases, but they're not the driving. My point is, they're not the driving factor initially.
And how often, like you mentioned, the Ice Age, and things like that. Even I've talked with guys like Michael Cremo who said that there's evidence maybe of at least 5, maybe 6 times before of these catastrophic events that might have wiped off whatever was here.
Well, it depends on the time frame you're talking about. If you look geologically, there are many, many catastrophic events. I think this is something that has occurred numerous times in Earth history. Even in the Pleistocene, the last 2.5 million years or so, you've had a number of ice ages, you've had a number of interglacials, you've had a number of major events, not all of which, but the majority of which I believe are solar driven, solar induced by varying solar activity. Relatively minor, and I hate to bring up the subject, but
no, it's okay.
If someone will probably bring it up or be thinking about it. There's been a lot of hubbub, I'll use that term, a lot of nonsense recently about a comet toward the end of the last ice age, which, the evidence is just not there for that. That reputed evidence has not stood up to scrutiny. And when you really look at the evidence, I am absolutely convinced what's driving things is solar activity.
Amazing. All right, and just for the record, listeners, I will get to your questions the last hour, I promise. We've got quite a few questions coming in. So now getting back to the Sphinx, how exactly did they? I mean, have you thought about? You had to have thought about how they moved these blocks, right? I mean, these things had to have weighed.
Okay, so if we're talking about the Sphinx, Owen, can I put a plug in for Contact in the Desert?
You can plug whatever you like.
Oh, okay. I'll plug a couple of things while I'm thinking about. That's okay, because I'm going to be talking about all of this in May. Next month, I'll be at Contact in the Desert at Joshua Tree. I think it's the 19th through the 22nd or so of May, but I would really encourage people to come to that if they're interested, because there'll be a number of speakers. It serves something for everyone. I'll be giving a presentation. I think I'll be doing a workshop. I'll be doing intensive. So all of these topics, people would like to come and speak with me in person about them. That's a great opportunity. And people can get information on that and other things from my website, which, can I give my website?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I've got it linked up on our website.
Okay, but for those that are listening in verbally, maybe, it's www.robertschoch, and my name is spelled RobertSchoch, so all run together, .com. So the main thing is Schoch is spelled SCHOCH. Sometimes people get that wrong, but www.robertschoch.com, and people will see link to the my book Forgotten Civilization, the role of solar outbursts in our past and future, and also a new book I just had come out with Robert Bouvard. It's coming out in the next week or so, which is called Origins of the Sphinx, where, to address the questions you had, or you were just maybe the topic you were just now broaching, Origins of the Sphinx really goes into great detail as to the dating and redating of the Sphinx, but that's a companion, if you would, to what I see as my major book at the moment, Forgotten Civilization. So if people haven't read Forgotten Civilization, I would suggest starting with that. But getting to the Sphinx, your question about the Sphinx, when they carved the Sphinx itself is solid limestone. It's a huge statue. It was carved out of bedrock. It was not moved. It's not composed of blocks of stone. But when you look at it, it sometimes looks like to the untrained eye that's made out of a bunch of blocks of stone. Those are repairs to the highly eroded body, where the ancients, and when I say ancients, some of these repairs are 4,500 or so years old. They were repairing the much more ancient structure. But what they did 12,000 years ago, when they first carved the body of the Sphinx, is they had to cut down into the bedrock. To do that, they could have done it the easy way. They could have just used picks and axes and whatnot and chipped away the rock into little, rubble, and then maybe use baskets to scoop it out. That's not what they did. They actually carved out huge limestone blocks, some of them weighing 50 to 80 or 100 tons. So this is 12,000 or so years ago when they originally carved, when the core body of the Sphinx was originally carved. They carved out these huge blocks. They moved them just east of the Sphinx and erected what is now known as the Sphinx Temple, and just to the south of the Sphinx Temple, the Valley Temple. So when you go there today, in modern times, you will see two ruinous temples, because they're about 12,000 years old, in front of the Sphinx and just to the south of the Sphinx. So the real question, and I think this is what you were just asking, is how did they move these blocks of limestone that weigh tens of tons, some of them, 50 tons or more easily. And they were moving them in confined spaces, etc. And I wish I could give you an answer, but I don't have one. I really don't know. I don't know. I've talked to engineers. I've thought about it a lot. The standard argument, of course, from the archaeologists is that they just used a lot of labor, and they were using levers, and they'd have thousands of people on ropes, grunting away. When you really look at it, and you look at the tolerances, and you look at the space that they had to move in, there's no place for thousands of people. There's no place for hundreds of people. In some cases, there's no place for even a few dozen people to move.
So
it's really mysterious to me. But in some ways, I feel it's not my problem.
All right, I was going to ask you. Could there be any chance, or is there any evidence of maybe a higher technology than they're given credit for?
I think there was a higher technology, and I think there was probably a technology that they were using that we're not aware of, that we don't understand. And I think part of the problem is that many of us, maybe all of us, and I try to avoid it, but I'll put myself in this camp, we get stuck in the rut of thinking in terms of our technologies and what we can do today and how we would move things, how we do move things today, versus they may have been using something very, very, very different that we just don't think about, that we can't really imagine. And, maybe someday we'll hit upon it, or we'll find some hall of records. In fact, there is a chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx, which geophysicist Thomas DeBecke and I found back in the early 90s, which Edgar Cayce had predicted would be there, and he said it's the Hall of Records of Atlantis. And, I don't know what to think of all that. But, maybe at some point we will find the answer to the technology they were using, and then all of a sudden we'll sort of smack ourselves on the head and say, oh, isn't this simple after all? But when you're not thinking in those terms, and it's a totally different paradigm and worldview, it's very, very hard to anticipate ahead of time.
So my understanding is that they've not found a chamber under the paw, or they have?
There is a chamber under the paws. I absolutely stand by that, because I found it with Thomas de Becky back in the early 1990s. What has happened is I've not been allowed to explore it, to go into it. And the Egyptian authorities, there's a lot of politics in Egypt. For a long time, a man named Zai Hawass was in charge of all the antiquities in Egypt, in particular the Giza Plateau. He was very opposed to my theories and my work and my research and my conclusions, and he simply denied the evidence that we accumulated for this chamber, because it's based on seismic data, which I believe is very consistent and clear, and denied that it was there. And it's sort of been a stalemate. Right now I'm hoping, and I feel like I made some progress this summer talking with authorities in Egypt. I'm hoping that we can raise money and get permission to explore the chamber. It's very important. It's probably flooding at the moment because of Cairo. Cairo's a huge city, and so there's been all kinds of water pumped in, to satisfy the population. Water tables are rising because of, wastewater being pumped underground, etc. So there's actually some, how should I say, there's a time frame here. The clock is ticking away, because whatever in that chamber could be destroyed.
I was going to say, how do we know that they hadn't already raided that chamber?
Well, I don't see any evidence of that. I've been back to Egypt, a couple of times in the past year. They may have, it's not impossible that they somehow drilled into it, that type of thing. I don't have and put a little camera in. I can't preclude that, but I've not seen on the ground any evidence that they've actually, full scale entered it. It's in bedrock. It's in bedrock. I know of no accessible entrance to it. Where I think the entrance is in a cliff face that is due east of the Sphinx, which is currently under 10 or more meters of sand, which would have to be excavated.
Well, with the technology we have today, you would think we'd be able to scan and find it immediately, Well,
yes, but it's not a matter of the technology we have today. It's a matter of getting permission from the Egyptian authorities.
Well, yeah, sometimes they're afraid that, their belief system could be shattered.
Well, exactly. There's a lot of people that are afraid their belief system could be shattered. And this is something I've been dealing with for over a quarter century, of people not wanting to give up their beliefs, not wanting to give up their paradigms. And to this day, a lot of people in and out of academia, but particularly in academia, and I'm a full-time academic.
Well,
I get a lot of bad whatever from some of my fellow academics who still continue to attack me, and they don't want to see the evidence. They don't want to look at the evidence that civilization, there was an earlier cycle of very sophisticated civilization that was decimated. And they want to believe that civilization did not arise until about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. But what I'm saying, and I have lots of evidence for now, is that there was this earlier cycle of civilization before 9700 BC. It went extinct, if you would. It was decimated at the end of the last ice age. And there was a dark age, what we can call a dark age, from about 9700 BC to the re-emergence of civilization some 6,000 or more years later. What actually I call now SIDA, Solar-Induced Dark Age, which, to give credit where credit is due, my wife Katie actually came up with that acronym initially, and I love it. And it's sort of ironic that the sun would induce a dark age, but that's exactly what happened. There was a solar-induced dark age, and that dark age lasted, as I said, from the end of the Ice Age, about 9700 BC, based on Greenland ice cores, to the reemergence of civilization about 3,500 BC. So it actually lasted longer than civilization has existed since it reemerged a little over 5,000 years ago.
Wow.
So to me, this is a very compelling story, and it's not just sort of, vague human interest. Oh, isn't that interesting about ancient civilizations? To me, it has real lessons for us today because they were vulnerable. We are incredibly vulnerable to solar activity, and all the signs are that the sun is becoming very erratic and volatile at the moment, so we had better prepare ourselves.
So for the Ice Age to take place, and then what would happen, I guess, just trying to think this through. So the major earthquakes that would happen would set off the volcanoes, which would then block the sun from us, or does the sun not have to be blocked?
No. When you have, at the end of the last Ice Age, you have volcanic activity increasing, your earthquake activity increasing, et cetera, et cetera. But the main thing is that the solar outburst really snapped us out of the last Ice Age with the increased activity of the sun and the melting of the glaciers, and essentially a reorganization of climate and atmosphere, and probably oceanic circulation patterns, that type of thing.
Uh-oh. You never know. Mother Nature might say it's time to put them on freeze again.
Yeah, that could well be.
Yeah, so now the original sites for the Great Pyramid, and even some of the other structures, were these weren't all constructed at the same time, or were they? Like
the sites for the pyramids?
Yeah.
Well, the pyramids you have on the Giza Plateau, you have the Great Pyramid, the Second Pyramid, and then the much smaller Third Pyramid, and these are classically by the Egyptologists attributed to the pharaohs Khufu, also known as Cheops, Khafra, also known as Chephren, and Menkaura, also known as Mycerinus, in that order. And they all are classically dated to about 2550 BC to maybe 2450 BC, somewhere in that range. Bottom line is that I believe, just like the Sphinx, and the evidence, I'm basing this on evidence, that they were being reused at that time. That in 4th Dynasty, classical Egyptian period, around 2500 BC, you have what were older structures being reused, older structures that were being refurbished. So yes, you can point to evidence for the 4th Dynasty on all the pyramids, but that doesn't mean those are the original structures. They were being reused, they were being refurbished, they were being rebuilt to a certain extent. And there's a very strong argument, and we talk about this in Origins of the Sphinx, Robert Bouval and myself, and like I said, it goes with my book Forgotten Civilization, very strong argument that the basic mapping or layout on the Giza Plateau of the 3 pyramids, the sites, the original sites go back much, much earlier, go back to the end of the last Ice Age. So for instance, I have no doubt in my mind that when you go into the Great Pyramid, those have visited the Great Pyramid, if you go down into what's known as the descending passage into the subterranean chamber, you are in a chamber that dates back much further than dynastic times. And this is a much more ancient creation structure. It's basically the Great Pyramids on what we could call a sacred mound that goes back well before dynastic times. It's also interesting that how would you survive a major solar outburst? What would you do to prepare for another one? You would build underground structures, and we see that right on the Giza Plateau. Actually, on the Giza Plateau, something that was pointed out to me recently, and then I confirmed it and looked at it very carefully, is you have evidence of a major plasma strike from the end of the last ice age. You have evidence where apparently the plasma actually caused vitrification of the rock as it's known, and you find this in other areas also dating back to the end of the last ice age. So we have direct evidence of this solar outburst and places where these incredibly fast-moving electrically charged particles, plasma, actually hit the surface of the Earth, caused vitrification. For those that don't know what vitrification is, it's essentially the surface melting of rock because it's hit by such intense heat and energy that it essentially melts and sort of boils and then congeals, and it causes what's known as vitrification or glassification. It creates a natural glass on the surface.
All right, Robert, hold on with us for a minute. We've got to take a break. A call here. This is coming from Kansas City, Missouri. Who we got on the line here? And welcome aboard.
Hi, this is Janice.
Hi, Janice. How are you?
Hello.
I'm doing good, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. It's great to have you on.
Thank you, thank you. I have a question for the guest.
Okay.
So I know you've said, and I've heard a lot of other, researchers and, people who look into these, these megalithic structures and things like that. A lot of them have said the same thing, that the Egyptian government has stopped them at a certain point from being able to continue. Do you think they already know what's going to be found, and that's why they have no need to go and uncover it because they already know? Or, what are your thoughts on why they might not want people?
No, I don't think it has anything to do. This is Robert Schock. I don't think it has to do with them already knowing. I think it has more to do historically with them fearing what might be found. That there is an incredible inertia, should we say, and you see this not just with the Egyptian government, to be fair, but with academics, with institutions around the world, where people have vested interest. They have put all of their scholarship, they've made their careers in a certain context, with a certain paradigm, with a certain worldview, with certain beliefs, and to find something or for something to be discovered that might rock the boat, that might shake everything, is very threatening to them on a psychological level, on spiritual level, religious level, and even from a very pragmatic level. That it even ties in with things like tourism. And I've dealt with Egypt quite a bit, where you have to have your Egyptian trained and native guide who gives the standard line, the standard academic view, and they don't want to deviate from that. And in many ways, and I've heard this many times, that they want to keep Egypt Egyptian. And something I have certainly been accused of is more than once is that I'm stealing Egypt from the Egyptians. When I start talking about the Sphinx being older and going back to an earlier period, somehow they take that as the Egyptians are no longer involved. And my response is, well, look, you're talking about the Sphinx. It hasn't been moved. It's in Egypt. These were just earlier Egyptians. It's not taking anything away from the dynastic Egyptians or any other Egyptians. It's simply pushing back the history further. And to me, it's adding to the greatness of Egypt, but not everyone sees that. I mean, people don't want to have their views changed. The other thing that plays into it, and I don't want to be accused of being against any kind of religion, that type of thing. But it is Arab country, it is Arab Republic, it is Muslim, and I have met many Egyptians that frankly have a disdain for ancient Egypt. These are not people, of course, in the Antiquities organization, but other Egyptians who, things that are pre-Muslim are not necessarily that welcome, and to then pour salt into wounds, so to speak, by pushing them back even further into the distant past is, not taken well. So I think there's a lot of politics and sociology and psychology involved.
Okay, so more than politics, it kind of sounds like you're saying, even if it's true, it would be such a change that no one's willing to listen to it.
Yes, exactly. I find this all the time. People don't want to change their minds. They don't want to change their belief systems. I literally, in some cases, in some contexts, have had people tell me, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to, I know what I believe, and that's that. And, they literally don't want to see evidence. They don't want to be confronted with the concept of having to rethink their belief systems.
That's
Yeah.
right.
I think the sad part is that these all fall right within those. If you actually believe what you claim you believe, it would change the timeline, but it fits.
Yeah, I agree. It fits the evidence. I mean, the evidence is there, and I think it actually gives the evidence gives expanded timeline. It changes the timeline, and I think it's much more exciting and also very telling, very important. But we know from many subjects, people even confronted with very good evidence, they don't want to change their belief systems.
No, that's a problem. It's we've been fighting that for a long time. People just won't get outside their box.
They won't get outside their box. They won't look at evidence. I mean, I think of the classic case, and again, I hate to bring up, maybe it seems trite now, but literally, and this is well documented, literally in the early 17th century, people didn't. Some of the academics, some of the, intelligentsia, we'll call it, they didn't want to look through Galileo's telescope because they were afraid what they might see, and they said, it would give false information. And then you have Egyptologists. You have someone like Zahi Hawass. I hate to bring this up, but he literally says he doesn't believe in radar. He doesn't believe in certain scientific techniques, and he just dismisses them out of hand. Well, why would you do that? Because if he did, quote, accept them, it would upset his belief system. It would upset things he's built his career upon, and you don't like having your career and everything you've believed for decades pulled out from under you with new evidence.
I've run into those types who that's just it, and I've said this before. They, to admit that something was wrong or that something new has been discovered would change everything that they've built their career on, and so
exactly.
Yeah.
So they'll do, in some cases, they will go to extremes to suppress, to cover up, to hide things, to attack people, and I've felt this myself too. I've been attacked many times by people who don't want to accept the evidence I've been presenting.
Yeah, well, you'll find that when you're being attacked, it's because you're on the right track. So
I agree with that.
Anything else?
No, I just want to thank Robert, and you touched on it. I'm sure you've had to deal with a lot, with doing this work, but there are a lot of us who appreciate it, and hopefully one day they'll finally release it mainstream and admit that they were wrong the first time.
Exactly.
And Michael, I thank you for taking my question. I appreciate it.
All right. Well,
Thank you very much.
thank you so
very
much.
Appreciate that.
We appreciate the call, and she's called in. I think she's called in before, and she always has good questions. All right, next up here we've got. It looks like David in Texas. David, welcome aboard.
Hey, Michael. Hello, guys. It's Robert, right? Did I get it right?
Yes, you did. Welcome aboard.
So let's go to the chase. I think like all of us, when I say us, me, I'm a listener, right?
Mm-hmm.
We want to pull that rug out. So here's my question for you. Does the geologic evidence suggest that the Sphinx was built pre-flood?
Yes, absolutely. Because I would date the flood, if you would, really to the end of the last ice age, where, in the first hour I was mentioning how, among other things, you had absolutely torrential rains. You would have had flooding on the surface of the earth. Something I may not have mentioned explicitly is that there were rising sea levels. At the end of the last ice age, with the ending of the ice age, sea levels rose around the globe approximately, an average 120 meters or so. So you're talking hundreds of feet. You had torrential rains coming down, flooding areas. So this is reflected in the flood, the biblical flood, but not just the biblical flood. In ancient histories and ancient legends, you have this around the world. And I also think you have direct evidence of this in terms of the incredible water erosion on the Sphinx, on the body of the Sphinx in the Sphinx enclosure, on the plateau, with the waving, undulating profile and the vertical fissures, which I've discussed in my work. So yes, absolutely, the Sphinx is pre-deluge, pre-flood, and goes back to what I refer to as that earlier cycle, that forgotten civilization.
So that's a great segue, right? Going with what the caller before me was just talking about, like why don't we hear this? Why
because
is it not being talked
it changes
about?
what people
Clearly,
want to think and believe. And I talk about this at some length in my book, Forgotten Civilization, the role of solar outbursts in our past and future.
So I think the reason why here is like, just if I may, right? Like the reason why is it's not so much that geologists and mainstream scientists and academia is saying that it didn't happen. For a large degree, more and more of you, Robert, are saying that this is so, but they're not putting it out there. They're not putting it out there it's not in the textbook. My 12-year-old's not
in the textbooks. It's not getting the traction it should in a way, because let me put it this way. When I have talked about this, and this has been for over 25 years now, when I present the data to my fellow geologists, for instance, at Geological Society of America meetings and that type of thing, they agree with me. They think it's pretty straightforward. My evidence is good, the data is good, etc. Those that are objecting are the archaeologists, the Egyptologists, the historians. And it's very interesting because my fellow geologists, they don't work in this field. They don't have any vested interest in how old Egypt is or how old the Sphinx is. So they can be fairly objective looking at the data and see that what I'm doing is logical and follows the basic evidence and scientific protocols, and they don't have a problem with it. In fact, they're very supportive of it, but they also don't have a vested interest. It's not pulling the rug out from under their careers. But those that it is assaulting, at least they see themselves as being assaulted, the archaeologists and the prehistorians and the Egyptologists and the historians, they're the ones that are objecting. I've had Egyptologists literally say to me that they don't understand my data, they don't understand the science, they don't understand the evidence I'm presenting, but they know, and they'll use that term, they know what the age of the Sphinx is, and they know I am wrong. Um, and they've even been somewhat threatening and said things to the effect that there's lots of rocks elsewhere than Egypt, and I should go look at rocks somewhere other than in Egypt, and basically not threaten them. And they're sort of threatening back that there could be bad consequences for me if I continue to pursue the subject, which they don't want me to pursue. I've not.
Let's be real here.
Obviously, I've not.
Let's be real.
I have
continued
to pursue it.
I'm sorry. That's money talking. Those people that are saying that, they have research that is invested, where you're talking about vested interest. Research has invested dollars to their research, right? So I have two things here, right? That same story about the flood, I'm not getting biblical here at all. It's not my intention. It's repeated all around this globe.
Oh, it's known around the world.
Go there.
Yeah. It's around the world. You don't need to be biblical.
Yep.
And it ties in with the last ice age and the solar outburst that occurred and what was happening geologically. We have evidence for this geologically around the world. So, you can talk about the flood or the floods at the end of the last ice age, and as far as I'm concerned, you don't need to get biblical or religious at all about it. Although I do take, honestly, I take the ancient, we'll call it legends, myths, texts, etc. I was trained, I suppose, when I was a graduate student, that you just ignored such things. Well, it turns out that they're very powerful. I would not base my conclusions on a bunch of ancient legends, but on the other hand, when ancient legends are in sync with the actual physical evidence, with the geological evidence, I think you have to look at them and take them somewhat seriously. If I could digress a little bit to a topic that many people love, a lot of my academic colleagues hate and don't want to hear about, that's Atlantis. Everyone, I think, knows the legend of Atlantis, or the story of Atlantis. Atlantis was a high civilization, a sophisticated, incredibly sophisticated culture that was destroyed by natural catastrophes literally overnight. And, of course, this comes from Plato. Plato's the main person that recounts the tale of Atlantis, and he states very explicitly that it came from Egypt, that Egypt had preserved this story of Atlantis. My point that I want to make right now is that Plato is explicit as to the dating of the fall of Atlantis. And when you put that into our calendar years, what is the date for the destruction of Atlantis? It's approximately 9600 BC, which is, as far as I'm concerned, spot on for the modern dating of the end of the last ice age. And I don't think this is coincidental that we have this legend, if you would, this story of Atlantis, and it talks about an early cycle of civilization that is destroyed by natural catastrophes, which fit the catastrophes that were occurring at the end of the last ice age. And Plato's chronology is, in fact, the modern chronology for the end of the last ice age.
So, Robert, I agree. I agree with you. I just want to, so I made the one point about what we were talking about earlier. And my second point here is, and it's meant to be comical, first of all.
Okay.
Right. So all this context of this conversation for the past 10 minutes, right? Before Fukushima, right, that nuclear disaster that happened in Japan, there were cave markings of tsunamis predating about 8,000 years ago.
Sure.
Of tsunamis coming in on those caves in Japan.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this information's been known, but those vested interests decided to build a nuclear reactor right on the other side of those caves.
It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy that what we've done in our hubris and our short-sightedness.
We forget to remember, Robert.
I want to mention something about Fukushima, if I could. And again,
Sure.
I only say this because I'm concerned about it, not because I'm trying to be some kind of alarmist. but we have nuclear power plants around the world. And when we have another solar outburst, which will come, it's going to bring down the modern grid system. What happens to power plants when they're disconnected from the grid system? They can't circulate, they can't cool properly, etc. We are looking at a situation where we could have Fukushimas around the world. And I hate to say that, but I'm if you haven't figured this out already, I'm not pro-nuclear power. I'm very anti-nuclear power. It has all kinds of problems. We never figured out how to get rid of the waste products. It's a very vulnerable type of power production, and we've set disasters to occur.
It would be the death of us, and that's what I worry most when people talk about catastrophes or even Planet X's and things. I say, okay, you got your food, you've got your water, and you're all set. But now, what are you going to do about all that radiation that's going to be coming your way?
And actually, it's not true. I don't want to contradict you, but you can only store so much food, you can only store so much water, and yes, we're going to be hit by radiation. And a lot of people, they're unrealistic, and I've spoken to a lot of people who are, I forget what they call it, preppers, that type of thing. Yeah, but you really can't. I mean, people don't understand the magnitude of what will occur. You're not going, how long can you live on cans of beans or whatever when everything is down? The electrical grid system is out. Your car is not going to start if you have a car made after about 1970. Why? Because modern cars are essentially computers with an engine tied to them. So when you have a major solar outburst, something that's going to be associated with it is what's known as a solar particle event or solar proton event, which will simply destroy the onboard computer of a car, and it's never going to work.
That's right.
It's really a horrible situation, and we have done. It seems like modern society has done everything it can to ensure our destruction when something like this happens, and I think we need to reverse it. I think we need to be working on preparing for these types of events and essentially saving the earth, and I don't think individuals can do that alone. I think we really need to be working on this collectively and having the very discussion we're having now.
Agreed, and David, you said it well. We forget to remember. And anything else before I've got to move on to another call here?
We're good. It's a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and you brought some great insight to the conversation as well. Because Fukushima, great example. And when people talk about surviving some big catastrophe, even a solar flare. My biggest thing is, I let them go and they're all happy because they've thought of everything. And I say, well, what about all the nuclear power plants? And it's like, you're a fearmonger. It's like, okay, let's take the next call.
Fear-mongering when there's truth to it. I mean, it's being realistic.
Yes. We've got this one's from New York. I wonder if this is KJ. Who do we got here?
Hey, Michael, how you doing? This is KJ.
Yeah, good. Well, welcome aboard. See, I'm getting to know you here. Thanks for the call. What's on your mind?
No, great show tonight. Definitely enjoyed listening to Robert. Robert, I mean, as somebody who has traveled extensively all over the world because of my job, and I always would, no matter where I'd go, I'd always try to find ancient sites. And just the technology alone required to create these sites, it's so obvious to anyone with half a brain that these are definitely more closer to 10,000-year-old sites than what people suggest or what they want to believe. Now, of course, when it comes to religion, the last thing religions want is they don't want to change one word, so let alone a whole concept or theory, because then their whole system is completely thrown out the window, and that's definitely something that governments don't want to have occur. But do you think, now this is personally what I think they know this, the powers that be, and they know the truth. Do you think that the fact that they know the truth and they know we're kind of on a collision course for another catastrophe, that's why they've allowed a lot of these things to occur? It's just a theory I've kind of always gone with, because I've always wondered.
I have no doubt at this point, and I used to not think this way. I used to be very scoff at, conspiracies and that people in the know would cover up knowledge, etc. But I've actually become convinced that essentially what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, there's a lot of truth to that there are people in the know, that there are, governments left and right, and very wealthy people are making preparations to, for themselves, but don't really want the general public to be scared or even informed about some of these things. And I suspect there are cover-ups and, disinformation being put out. You have a lot of, government agencies. I think of NASA, for instance, that they might say, oh, yes, these things occur, et cetera, blah, 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 but you don't have to worry about it because nothing's going to occur for thousands of years or tens of thousands of years, so it's silly to even think about it other than in an abstract way, and that's nonsense. I mean, we know from recent events, when I say recent events, the last 200 years, that I mentioned the Carrington event in 1859. If that occurs tomorrow, billions of people will literally die, not necessarily overnight, but in the next 2 years or so, as grid systems are knocked out, etc. A few years ago, there was a minor solar outburst, and if we had been in a different position in our orbit by a week or a week and a half or so, we would have been hit by it. Earth, would have been hit by it, and we would not be having this conversation right now, because electronics and electrical grid systems, etc., would have been knocked out, and they wouldn't be up and running again. Because when you, for instance, overpower electrical grid systems and blow out transformers, you can't just replace those. Right. They're not stockpiled anywhere. Major transformers, for instance, a lot of people don't realize this, are basically made to order. They have to be
and they're made in China,
and without electricity.
Right. And we're not getting along with China really well right now. So
no, we're not. No, we're not. And there are a lot of issues going on, and every day, and I've been saying this now for some years, certainly since my book came out, every day we as a society are becoming more and more vulnerable to these types of events. We're not improving the situation. The situation is actually going the other way. And every year, people can see this. We're more dependent on electronics and the internet and satellite communications, et cetera, all of which, with just a minor solar outburst, will be toast, as they say. Will be destroyed. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen when there's no electricity to pump gasoline, so you can't fill your cars? There's no electricity to run water plants, to distribute water.
Be a good day to sell bicycles.
What?
Right.
Be a good day to sell bicycles.
Yeah, be a good day to sell bicycles, but people won't be able to ride bicycles when they're starving to death because there's no way to distribute food.
Well, see, and truly, that's why I kind of always felt that they've known this. They know what's going to happen, as much as they don't want to, believe it or say, oh, there's no truth to the Bible and this, that, and the other thing. But the reality is, the way they've shaped our world in the last even 20 years, I mean, we're almost a cashless society. So they created everything based on an electronic form of transactions. So, which
most money doesn't exist other than as electronic bits. Yeah. And when you have a major, if we have a major solar outburst, or when we have it, those records are gone.
Oh yeah, everything. I mean, there was just I have a friend who works in communications for AT&T, and they just had a massive outage all over the United States. Yeah. And he basically, he said, they're not going to say what it is, but there has been just recently some solar activity, because the sun has actually been quite dormant, and then in the last couple days, it just got really crazy again, and it started putting out these flares. And he said, well, if it's just one city, it's usually the technology close by. He said, when it's major cities all over the country, that's definitely something, and they don't even want to say what that is.
No, they don't want to admit that we're vulnerable to these things. And also, I want to make the point, since you brought it up, some people have tried to claim or suggested, the sun is going dormant, it's not as active as it has been in the recent past, that maybe it's going cold, etc. And they take sort of solace in that. They think that, that's great, because now the sun won't be a problem. But in fact, studies, if you look at studies of the last 200 years, it's actually when the sun seems to be going dormant, it's not going dormant, it's becoming very volatile. And the major events that we've seen, for instance, again, I refer to the 1859 Carrington event. There was another one in 1921, when at that time in 1921, electrical systems were still relatively primitive. If we had a 1921 event, which was not as big as the 1859 event, if we have a 1921 level event tomorrow or the next week, it would still cause massive devastation. Yeah. But these were occurring when the sun was relatively calm or inactive.
Yeah, how lucky have we been? I mean, just think about it.
Right, and that's what I was just going to say, Michael. They're working off of just the premise of we've been lucky. That's it.
That's exactly it. It's been just luck.
It has been luck, yeah.
Luck won't last forever.
And their ability to just BS everyone, and of course, the major media outlets, and they're all connected highly up with the government, so we know they're not going to go rogue. Or they'll lose their FCC license.
They're not going to leak any information unless it'll hurt Donald Trump.
Exactly. And they have a vested interest in keeping the status quo. They don't want people getting upset. They don't want people excited. They want the American public to be, I'll put it so crudely, sort of complacent and placid and it's not,
and that's why I say I believe that this is
those
all
in power to have people think too much.
Right, and that's why I believe they truly know this like a well-written script, and that's why they're just playing this play. And most people, they're just numbing them with the drugs and the technology and the stupid TV shows and movies and sports, and they're just trying to keep them as numb and dumb as possible, because when a serious event does come, I mean, half these people, I don't even know if they'll even be able to process what's happening.
They won't. So they'll be trying to text their friends, and it's not going to happen. But KJ, I have to cut the call short here, because I do have to take one more break, and I do appreciate the call. However, thank you so much. And then we're going to come back and finish up, Robert. And what does Robert know or even think about what they found in Antarctica? Do you know any? I get a lot of questions.
Antarctica is a real problematic. I'm not sure exactly what what details are being asked about, but there's a lot of, how do I want to say it? There's a lot of how should we say, rumors about Antarctica without a lot of detail that I've actually been able to grasp onto. And something that I have found, and I'm not trying to evade the question, but something I've found is I don't like to, and I won't at this point in my career, express definitive opinions on things that I haven't been able to see or research on my own, because so many things can be misleading or partial. So, it's a big problem. I mean, one thing about Antarctica is that there's a lot of evidence that it was mapped, for instance, in pre-ice time by advanced civilizations, that there may be evidence of earlier cycle civilization somewhere in Antarctica, but I just can't say. I don't know at this point, and I haven't been there. And
well, I wonder now, you talked about people in ancient times maybe surviving in packs, maybe going below ground. Is it possible that, maybe these civilizations, I don't know, evolved underneath the ground and just stood there?
Yeah. I think there's actually a lot of evidence that civilization went underground, surviving the last ice age. And in fact, very interestingly, so this is now deviating from Antarctica, but to another area of the world, and that is Cappadocia in what's modern Anatolia, modern Western Turkey. And there you have, and this is well known, and it's very famous for the underground cities, some of which could hold tens of thousands of people. And I believe these go back, at least their origins go back to the end of the last ice age, when people had to go underground. That was the way to survive. Two points I want to make. At the end of the last ice age, 9700 BC, something that you see is the extinction of many, many large mammals. Well, why would they go extinct versus anything else? Because they could not survive on the surface, and they could not go underground. They couldn't go into caves. They couldn't go into burrows. So small animals did survive. Some humans did survive because initially they went into caves, something that's been found around the world now and documented is that associated with humans at the end of the last ice age are caves and tunnels, in some cases hastily carved or dug structures down into the bedrock. Why? Because they had to survive the radiation that was on the surface. And a colleague of mine, Paul Lavioletta, to give credit where credit's due, has calculated that large mammals, you had so much radiation on the surface that large mammals, and humans are large mammals, could die within days if they did not seek refuge elsewhere. So I wanted to get back to Cappadocia. It's very interesting that apparently a population survived in Cappadocia, and linguistic studies, totally independent lines of study, have documented that Indo-European language families go back to Cappadocia to the end of the last ice age and spread out from there. So this is independent confirmation that a population was able to survive where they could go underground.
All right. Anti-Rep asks, what does your guest think of Graham Hancock's 11,000 BP hypothesis?
Well, if you're talking about 11,000 BP hypothesis, I think you're talking about the comet and all that type of stuff.
I'm not certain because I haven't been able to get Graham on the show yet.
Okay, well, anyway, I will speak to that very briefly, and I don't want to sound nasty or that type of thing, but there's been a lot, and he has been an advocate of this, and I've spoken with him about it, and he and I absolutely disagree. 11,000, it's actually 10,900 BC. You have what's known as the beginning of the Younger Dryas, which was a cooling period that lasted for 1,200 years before the final end of the last ice age and the warming at 9,700 BC. And it's not original to Hancock, but it's really Firestone, a guy named Richard Firestone and his group, who some years ago put forward the hypothesis that a comet struck in approximately 10,900 BC and caused a 1,200-year cooling before the end of the last ice age. And this was very popular in some of the literature, and a lot of journalists like Hancock jumped onto the bandwagon, et cetera, and it makes for good, how should I say,
good, entertaining.
Things up. But when you look at it, and I'm a geologist, you look at the evidence, the hard evidence, it does not stand up to scrutiny. And without going into great detail now, because we don't have time, and I think would bore the listeners, but the bottom line is there's no evidence for a comet at that time. And I say that bluntly. What you do have evidence for is solar activity, and probably what's known as a SPE, solar proton event, which would have nucleated a lot of cloud cover and caused a cooling event before in 10,900 BC, before the major solar outburst at 9,700 BC, which snapped us out of the last ice age. So the 11,000 or 10,900 comet event that Hancock and others have spoken of, with all due respect, the evidence is not there. They talk about black mats and nanodiamonds and all this type of stuff. I've looked at that evidence very carefully, as have a number of competent researchers, a number of competent geologists, and a lot of it has been misidentified, misdated. So there's something known as a certain type of nanodiamonds, Lonsdaleite in particular, and they've been claims that this occurs at the Younger Dryas, beginning of the Younger Dryas, 10,900 BC. It turns out that these are very, very difficult to identify. There's probably only a couple of competent mineralogists in the world, literally, that can identify them. And so they've been misidentified. Other things have been misidentified. Again, I don't want to get into a bunch of technical arguments, but the bottom line is there's no evidence for it.
Okay. What does Robert know about the Sumerian tablets, and does he believe that the Sumerian culture is also much older than what we are told?
I suspect that the Sumerian, the origins of the Sumer probably go back much earlier, but what we have here is not, and I have to be careful in the way I say this, what we have in Sumer is what we have in Egypt, I believe, where you probably have earlier cycle of civilization that started to arise in that area and was decimated at the end of the last ice age. We went into the solar-induced dark age, Siddha, and then what most people think of as Sumer re-emerged. It was a re-emergence, just as we have a re-emergence of Egypt, and with dynastic Egypt, with pharaonic Egypt, about 3,200 or so BC. And I want to point out, when we're talking about Sumer, we're talking about Mesopotamia. With Sumer, you're talking about really lower Mesopotamia, or southern Mesopotamia. But something we haven't mentioned, or maybe I only mentioned in the briefest passing, is that in northern Mesopotamia, we have Göbekli Tepe. And Göbekli Tepe is this incredible site that was being excavated by the late Klaus Schmidt. Unfortunately, he passed away unexpectedly, but he was with the German Archaeological Institute. This is in Turkey, just north of the Syrian border. It's an incredibly sophisticated site with megalithic monuments, what are known as stone circles or stone enclosures. And what is really exciting about it is it's incredibly sophisticated, and there is absolutely no doubt that it goes back to about 9,700, 10,000 BC, to the end of the last ice age. It is part of this earlier cycle of civilization. And I talk extensively about it in my book, Forgotten Civilization, because this really is a linchpin. It really is incredible confirmation for what I've been talking about for decades, that there was this earlier cycle of civilization, which I first identified with the redating of the Great Sphinx. So
right.
What we're finding around the world is evidence, and this includes Mesopotamia, that there were these earlier civilizations, earlier cycle of civilization that preceded the was generally considered the classical origins of civilization.
All right, and we'll try to get a couple more questions in here before I give you the floor. I have a question for your guest. Is he aware of the Egyptian artifacts they found in the caves in the Grand Canyon?
I am aware of I'll put it, rumors, that type of thing. Yeah. I have never seen the actual artifacts. It all seems to be sort of mysterious, and I just don't know what to make of it. I don't know if it's a hoax. I don't know if they're fake. I don't know if they're real. I'm not judging them right now one way or another. I've tried to track this down to a certain extent, and haven't gotten very far. Ultimately, something like that, what I'd like to do is, if they really are real, if they are genuine, I'd like to see the actual artifacts in situ in the caves in the Grand Canyon. I just don't know what to make of it, to be honest.
All right. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hmm?
Oh, okay. Kat asks, does your guest think the continent found off the coast of New Zealand, I've heard about that, is part of what was once Atlantis?
I don't know about New Zealand, the material from New Zealand. This actually gets to one of my things about Atlantis, and I don't mean to evade the question, but I'm not a physical Atlantis hunter, and I don't mean that with any disrespect to those who are, but to me, the issue of Atlantis, and I know a lot of people who are interested, I mean very serious people, who are interested in trying to pinpoint the geographic position or location of Atlantis. You know, sites around the world have been suggested. But what to me is important for my analysis, my research, is not where is Atlantis physically, but when was Atlantis. And I mentioned that before, that it seems quite evident based on Plato that Atlantis was at the end of the last ice age, that it represents a major civilization, sophisticated society at the end of the last ice age. Now, where it was, whether it was off of New Zealand, whether it was in the Atlantic, whether it was Antarctica, whether it was Spain, you know, whether it was the Americas, you know, I've seen so many arguments for so many different areas. It's overwhelming, but again, not to evade the question, but for my own research, it's where it is not as important as when it was.
I would agree with that. All right, one last question. Klein asked, does history repeat itself, and what stage would we be in?
Oh, I think history repeats itself, and the immediate thought that comes to mind, if people understand or know about the Hindu Yuga cycle, I think we're in the Kali Yuga. I think we're in the bottom. We're probably approaching the bottom of the bottom. Yes, we have wonderful technology and all that type of thing, but I think that detracts from us in other ways. I think we're probably at a low point when it comes to spirituality and consciousness, etc. So, that's my in 30-second answer to that question.
All right, Robert, listen, I have enjoyed so much having you on the show tonight. Okay. I'd love to have you back in the future, and I want to give you the floor.
We'll do it again.
I'm sorry?
We'll do it again if you like.
Oh, absolutely. I'd like to give you the floor to get out anything that you like. And you've, I wasn't sure. I was asked to go to Contact in the Desert with one of my colleagues, and I wasn't sure. I'll tell you, I really want to get there now. I really do.
Yeah. So, well, I'd like to say people should come to Contact in the Desert, and we can speak in person. As I mentioned, I think in the earlier portion of this show, I'll be there next month. It's a Joshua Tree. People should go to my website, www.robertschoch.com, and remember that my last name is spelled S-C-H-O-C-H, so www.robertschoch, all one word, .com. And I've got a link to Contact in the Desert. I've got a link to links to other things. I've got a link to my book, Forgotten Civilization, which I recommend to everyone. Not because I'm trying to sell books, but because I think this information is really important. And Forgotten Civilization, I talk both about this earlier cycle of civilization, but also, as the subtitle states, the role of solar outbursts in our past and our future. So I would encourage people to look into this, and I hope to see people at Contact in the Desert, and we can talk in person.
All right, Robert. Well, listen, thank you again, and I look forward to talking to you again in the very near future, and hopefully maybe I'll see you at Contact in the Desert.
Oh, that would be great, and I really appreciate it. I had a lot of fun. This was a great show.
Well, thank you. I've had a lot of fun, too. It's too bad that, the timetable, we have to end it. I got so much.
Yes, of course.
But, yeah, thank you again, Robert. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right. Have a great night. And, folks, if nothing else, just listening to Robert tonight should make you want to get to Contact in the Desert. It's worked for me. I'll tell you. I mean, what a presentation it's going to be.
Thank you for listening to the first hour of Late Night in the Midlands. To finish listening to this episode, go to lnmradionetwork.com and become a subscriber. Becoming a subscriber is easy. There is a link on every page to take you to the subscription page. The cost is low, and you would be supporting Late Night in the Midlands and all of our efforts to bring you the truth. Again, go to lnmradionetwork.com, click on the subscribe button, and you can finish listening to this episode as well as all of the other shows that are in our archives.